Good morning and welcome. I am Michael Kessler, Assistant Director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown, where I teach in the Department of Government. I am delighted to welcome you here for what will be an engaging day of conversation about the past, present, and future of political theologies, although after last night we were supposed to call that the theologies of the political, in the Abrahamic traditions. Last night we were treated to an impassioned conversation about these topics between Mark Lilla and John Milbank. Today, panelists will continue that conversation in detail. It is now my pleasure to introduce the distinguished panelists for this morning's first panel on Domesticating Religion, the Abrahamic Faiths, and the Rise of the Democratic State. Patrick J. Deneen is an associate professor of government and holds the Marcos and Eleni Sakopoulos Kounalakis Chair in Hellenic Studies at Georgetown University in the Department of Government. He is, in 2008 and 2009, the Ann and Herbert W. Herbert Vaughan Visiting Fellow at the James Madison Program at Princeton University. Patrick is the author of The Odyssey of Political Theory and Democratic Faith, as well as co-editor of a book entitled Democracy's Literature. He is currently working on a book examining the concept of the division of labor in Western political thought. In 2006, Deneen became the founding director of the Tocqueville Forum on the Roots of American Democracy, an initiative at Georgetown that seeks to preserve and extend understanding of Americans' founding principles and their roots in the Western philosophical and religious traditions. Jerome Kopolsky is assistant professor of philosophy and religion and director of the Judaic Studies program at Goucher College. He previously taught at Virginia Tech. In the wake of the shootings there in 2007, Kopolsky developed a lecture on the influence of civil religion in mourning and memorialization. Kopolsky also served as visiting professor at Indiana University. Among his many publications is a major co-authored article, The Pledge of Allegiance and the Meanings and Limits of Civil Religion, in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. Eric Gregory is assistant professor of religion at Princeton University, where he joined the faculty in 2001. His teaching and research interests include religious and philosophical ethics, theology, political theory, bioethics, and the role of religion in public life. In 2007, he was awarded Princeton's President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. After graduating from Harvard, Eric studied theology at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and received his doctorate in religious studies from Yale University. He is author of the book Politics and the Order of Love, an Augustinian Ethic of Democratic Citizenship, as well as articles on religion and social ethics, including Before the Original Position, the Neo-Orthodox Theology of the Young John Rawls. Paul Heck is assistant professor of Islamic Studies in the Department of Theology here at Georgetown. His publications on Islam treat conceptions of jihad, moral dimensions of mysticism, religious renewal, scripture-based politics, eschatological sensibilities, and the transmission of religious knowledge. He is the author of The Construction of Knowledge in Islamic Civilization and has edited a collection of articles on Sufism and politics, forthcoming shortly as an issue of Princeton Papers. Current projects include two monographs, The Theology of Islamic Politics, which looks at the connection of faith outlook and political attitudes in Islam, and The Crisis of Knowledge in Islamic Civilization, which is a full treatment of the phenomenon of skepticism in Islam and the varied responses to it. The format here will be rather informal. Each of us will take about 10 or 12 minutes to give a summary and highlights of the larger paper that we are developing for an edited volume that all of the panelists' papers will become. And at the end of that time, I'll give my summary as well, and then I have some concluding reflections about some common themes that I see across the papers, and then we will engage in a conversation about issues that arise among all of our papers, including issues that we discussed last night, and then we'll have an opportunity to engage in a larger conversation with all of you. So please join me in welcoming the panelists, and then we can get started. And I've asked Patrick Deneen to begin the day.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Berkley Center for bringing me back to Georgetown. It's nice to be here for a visit, at least. The title of my presentation and paper is called The Great Combination, Modern Political Thought and the Collapse of the Two Cities. It's intended to be a response to Mark Lila's argument in his book discussed last night, The Stillborn God, that modern political thought represents a great separation. So I will try to develop that a bit in the course of my comments. Now, political theology, or the theology of the political, as Mark Lila instructs us in his book, The Stillborn God, is, quote, a discourse about political authority based on a revealed divine nexus. That is, political theology is the effort to associate or affiliate political authority with appeal or reference to a comprehensive doctrine of divine beings or doctrines thereto. It thus represents an intermingling not only of church and state, but of theology and politics in the deepest sense, a condition in which the authority and legitimacy of the state and politics itself derives its force and definition from the society's understanding of the divine. According to Lila, political theology was, for the most part, the basis for political authority for most of human history. Certainly in the West, the area about which he is most concerned, at least until the inauguration of the Great Separation, begun and inaugurated in the early modern period, above all, he argues, by Thomas Hobbes, and subsequently developed by thinkers such as Locke, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, and others. The Great Separation was an effort to remove appeals to the divine nexus in connection to political authority, and instead sought to vest political authority wholly in terms that are rational, secular, and therefore separate from religious understandings. Now, I want not only to disagree with Lila's thesis, but to argue, in fact, that the opposite is the case. What Lila would argue constitutes the great separation of modernity is actually, in my view, the great combination, and constitutes the true political theology of the West that was inaugurated during the very modern period that he would urge us to embrace. What liberalism was premised upon at base was an effort to overcome the actual great separation that I would argue had been effected by St. Augustine in his West-shaping work, The City of God. If anything, Augustine's great separation undermined all claims to ultimate political legitimacy by political leaders and authorities. And hence, he was able to observe that all cities are in some senses robber bands to an extent, and challenge the ultimate authority of political leaders in light of their investment in the city of man. By contrast, the great combination, as was effected by Hobbes and other modern thinkers, made it possible for the state to incorporate religion wholly within its sphere, giving it a sole legitimacy, giving it, that is to say the state, a sole legitimacy that would be impossible in an Augustinian understanding. Now, Lila understates or misses the various ways that liberalism, in fact, robustly puts theological categories and considerations in the service of undergirding state legitimacy. He claims with different iterations that the liberal order sought the separation, quote, of political discourse from theological discourse. Yet this claim does not correspond to the deepest theological underpinnings of liberalism in its early modern and subsequently its progressive forms. These are roughly the two periods that Lila treats in the two respective chapters of Part 2 of The Stillborn God, the kind of intellectual history of modernity. Instead, looking squarely at the evidence, what one sees instead is the effort to overcome Augustine's great separation by means of two distinct great combinations, I call them, each corresponding roughly with a development within liberal theory. First, in its classical conception enunciated most clearly by Hobbes and Locke, and secondly, in its progressive period, as witnessed in thinkers such as Rousseau and John Stuart Mill, among others. This great combination represents a true form, and indeed a radical form of political theology, collapsing what Augustine had sought to hold apart, seeking fulfillment in the world by combining the two cities. Now, in the brief time that's given me, I can only give the roughest outline of how I see this taking place, but let me offer the briefest synopsis of how these two stages of liberalism affect this kind of combination. I begin by talking about the first wave of liberalism. Here I'm using kind of Strauss's language of the three waves, the three waves of modernity. This first wave of liberalism, inaugurated by Hobbes and Locke, was premised upon a fundamental shift in thinking about religion. In this sense, I think I agree completely with Leela's argument. Hobbes's political project was motivated by the ambition to reduce the public manifestation of religious differences, a result of the Protestant Reformation. However, Leela goes astray in supposing that this project aimed at a great separation. What instead Hobbes aspired to achieve was a great combination of religion and politics, of church and state, with the aim that religion and the church would serve as reinforcement and lend legitimation to the ruling apparatus of the Leviathan. A mere glance at the frontispiece of the Leviathan confirms that Hobbes' ambition was to create a true political theology. It portrays the sovereign, which is, of course, composed of a populace looking up at the Leviathan, who holds in one hand the sword, and in the other hand holds the crozier. In him, church and state, theology and politics are combined, a combination that is reinforced in the pictures that line both sides of the page below the main illustration, portraying the aspects of life and world that come under the sovereign's governance, ranging from the arts of war on the one side to religious disputation and doctrine on the other, all of which are to be governed and ruled and finally decided by the sovereign. Under a single head, then, church and state, religion and politics are brought together. Now, this is all confirmed by further philosophical development, especially in books 3 and 4 of the Leviathan. Again, I don't have time to go through that entire argument, but I'm happy to talk about that a bit more in the discussion. Thus, Hobbes was among the most effective and celebrated inaugurators of the great combination that marked the rise of early modern liberalism. Now, Leela recognizes that Hobbes argued in support of a kind of civil religion, as I'm suggesting, but argued that Hobbes set into motion a philosophic revolution that leads to liberalism's separation of church and state, particularly in the ways that Hobbes' argument is adapted by John Locke, whom he says, quote, was able to render a new liberalism, now, quote, without making reference to the nexus between God, man, and the world. Yet extraordinarily, such a claim wholly ignores the ways in which Locke relies equally and extensively, as Hobbes does, upon religion as a fundamental support for the liberal regime that he envisions. While Locke is celebrated for inaugurating a decisive break between church and state and rejecting a form of established religion, in his letter, the justly celebrated Letter Concerning Toleration, Locke also betrays in that text the extent to which the liberal order rests upon a necessary theological basis. For Locke, in particular, the obligation of citizens to the regime, becomes a significant challenge in ways that it wasn't for Hobbes. When you have an all-seeing, all-pervasive Leviathan, obligation isn't that difficult. You simply force people to do what you want them to do. But for Locke, lacking that kind of enforcement mechanism, and thus creating this problem of obligation among a freely choosing contracted citizenry, Locke is forced to fall back upon religion as a necessary and useful ultimate enforcer of social behavior. Thus, in the closing passages of the Letter Concerning Toleration, Locke argues against the extension of toleration to atheists because they cannot be trusted to keep their vows and oaths, who will ultimately force them to be true to their word if they don't have the fear of God. As Locke writes, those who are not to be tolerated, they are not to be tolerated who deny a being of God. Promises, covenants, and oaths are the bonds of humane society and can have no hold upon an atheist. The thought of taking away God dissolves all. Thus, a salutary fear of eternal damnation is the ultimate guarantor of the terms of the social contract, a contract whose signatories, as self-interested and self-maximizing individuals, might otherwise have every desire to break at first possible moment if they believe that no earthly power could see or punish them. For Hobbes and Locke alike, and later for the more deistic American founders, religion is put in the service of the needs of the polity. Now, this may represent, in Leela's terms, a form of separation, excavating reflection upon the relationships of the city of God and man. But more deeply, the arguments of early modern liberalism represent a form of political theology in which theology is placed wholly in the service of state legitimation, and thus represents a profound combination. The city of God, in this sense, is put in the service of the city of man. And to this extent, early modern liberalism constitutes more truly a form of political theology than suggested or admitted by Leela, particularly as he states, if political theology is, quote, the effort to connect our political discourse to theological and cosmological questions, and seeks to recognize that religion, quote, is politically authoritative. Now, in both these senses, Hobbes and Locke, it seemed to me, fit that definition of political theology quite well. And moreover, it represents a political philosophy in which theology no longer serves to limit, restrain, or chasten the ambitions of the political, but to wholly support or undergird its modern ambitions of mastery and of growth and expansion. To this extent, Leela seems to get the argument wrong. Political theology is a modern phenomenon, and one that, in combining the concerns of the state with the sanction of religion, represents a supremely dangerous and combustible mix. Let me turn briefly to the second wave of modern liberalism, or what I call progressive liberalism. Now, in contrast to the civil religion defended by the proponents of the first wave, the second wave of liberal theorists were far more explicit in their criticisms of religion, since even the civil religions of the first wave liberals, not to mention traditional Christianity, maintained a belief that human beings are not subject to a kind of fundamental alteration. As Madison would state, men are not angels, and one cannot hope to make them angels. Later, progressive liberals held that human beings are capable of, or at least possible, to conceive of a kind of moral perfectibility, and that politics can be the domain of a kind of moral ascent and perfection. For this reason, thinkers of the second wave of modern liberalism, such as Rousseau, Mill, Marx, and in the US, thinkers like John Dewey and others, exhibit an even more ferocious critique of traditional religion, and in particular, its view of original sin, but end up arguing, in a sense, for a new form of a political religion. Thus, rather than putting religious in the service of politics, which one sees among the first wave liberal thinkers, politics is seen as the venue of a kind of new religious apotheosis, making the city of man into the city of God. Invariably, second wave thinkers propose a new religion to replace the old religion, a religion of humanity, such as that proposed by Auguste Comte and embraced by John Stuart Mill, fervently embraced by Mill. So even as Mill could praise all forms of experiments in living, the one form of experiment in living which he had to condemn was Calvinism, because Calvinism precluded, with its theory of original sin and human depravity, precluded the possibility of a kind of ascent to a religion of humanity. This is a kind of precursor of public reason, if you want to put it in those terms. You can't allow certain things to be said even in a liberal society. Similarly, in the thought of John Dewey, there is a call to achieve a kind of secular salvation. And it was especially through progressive education that he believed that we would reach a time, quote, when the distinction between the spiritual and the secular has ceased, and the church and state, divine and human organization of society are one. Stunningly, those of you who are faculty members out there will be happy to learn this, Dewey considered the teacher, quote, to be the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true God, and ultimately would bring about the kingdom, the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. Properly organized, the school or the university was an agent of redemption for progressive humanity, and the avenue by which the city of God could be created within or transform the city of man. Thus, far from representing a great separation, thinkers in the second wave envision a new religion in which humanity is its central deity and earth is a heaven aborning. In conclusion, I want to argue on behalf of a great separation. Modern thought, particularly these two iterations of liberalism now dominant on today's political scene, indeed I would argue that the first wave liberals are our contemporary conservatives, while our second wave liberals are our contemporary progressives, or we could say shorthand Republicans and Democrats, represent not the legacy of separation, but of combination. Above all, for their many differences from one another, both liberalisms place the human will in a place of ascendance, give a place of sole legitimacy of governance and violence to the state, and view the world and nature, and even humanity itself, as being subject to human dominion, command, and manipulation. Leela, I think, paints a dramatic portrait of an age of a pre-modern violence born of religious warfare, and contrasts that with a placid and peaceful condition of modern liberalism in which toleration, industriousness, and prosperity govern. But left unsaid, I think, is the way in which there is a violent basis on which liberalism itself was based, mainly directed toward a world that was viewed through a Gnostic lens of discontent and dissatisfaction, one requiring a remaking by means of human dominion. a new conception that was made possible by a great separation that lent legitimizing force of religion to state structures and the ascendancy of human will. I would quote only from Francis Bacon, one of John Dewey's favorite quotes, who wrote that we should understand our relationship to nature like that of a jailer to its prisoner, and like a jailer seeking to extract its secrets, must engage in torture, if necessary, to find out the secrets that are being withheld from us. This is a belief I think we can no longer afford. Everywhere we are presented with evidence of depletion and destruction that our brief experiment with modernity has left us. What is needed is a true separation, an acknowledgement, returning, I think, to an Augustinian understanding that we are not God and cannot treat the world or human beings as means to our individual satisfaction or aspiration to perfectibility. If our modern faith is marked above all by forms of great combination of religion and politics, then I can at least agree with Mark Lila that what is needed is a new great separation, albeit one that truly separates what should not have been put together in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Only a minute and a half over, so well done. Next, Eric Gregory.
Okay. Thanks to you for coming, and thanks to the Berkley Center. I grew up in the shadow of Georgetown and always thought it was a great Catholic city on a hill, to mix metaphors. And this is the first time I've ever spoken here, so it's an honor. One of my colleagues has a bumper sticker I like. It reads, "Too concrete, be more abstract," which some of you may realize is an inversion of what most professors tell their students, but having 12 minutes means I'm going to follow this injunction. But I'm going to put my cards on the table and try to tell enough noble lies to provoke. Each of these words, equality, rights, democracy, have an essentially contested history. Some want to junk them, others re-signify them, and still others in the West want to tell the old story again. Fortunately, I don't have to recount this history. I'm going to do two things. First, a few remarks about what I see as the landscape of political theology today, particularly in Christian, Jewish, and liberal discourse, the traditions I know best. And then a few specific things about Christianity and the rise of the democratic state, the theme for this panel. Okay, 4 models as live options for contemporary political theology. And these are ideal types. There are no doubt other possibilities and combinations. First, political theology means anything to do with religion and politics, usually focusing on questions of legitimacy and church-state issues regarding liberty and accommodation. I think this is the approach one finds in political science and jurisprudence as practiced at, say, the APSA, including most political theorists, but also the way most scholars of religion interact with these disciplines. Consider the massive industry on John Rawls and his critics, the debates about civil religion, or the approach to religion in the textbook histories of political philosophy. This approach assumes the category religion and politics as a neutral description, and more often than not treats religion as a generic phenomena of human culture. Let's call this first model the liberal approach to religion and politics. But it relies heavily on a Christian background, which practically invented ideas of religion and secular as separate spheres of human activity. Liberalism is how we think and practice politics in the West, after what Professor Lila calls the Great Separation. A second model. Political theology is the effort to identify shared concepts between philosophy and theology proper, and then make inferences about politics. Images of community, notions of moral obligation, law, and virtue, statements about human nature are compared and contrasted. Consider Christian beliefs about the image of God or original sin in light of democratic language about the dignity of the individual or the limits of politics. Straussian debates over reason and revelation, or more recently, postmodern discussions of St. Paul and the ethics of the neighbor. This approach often looks like mining religion for something that looks familiar to modern eyes, bearing the marks of genealogy and historicism. Less critically, we might say this approach appropriates theological debates as illuminating diagnostics for political theory. It's a way of doing intellectual history in order to make arguments. It can be done as modernity criticism, pointing out the incoherence of secularized concepts of politics, just as someone like Anscombe pointed out the incoherence of secularized concepts about morality. Now, as an aside, I may be full of the audacity of hope, and yes, we can. I see a turn in academic political theory away from the liberal communitarian debate, or at least a boredom with that debate, and renewed interest in the history of political philosophy, including religious thinkers. Third, there's a more ambitious kind of theology, or kind of political theology, that I think is perhaps truer to an original sense. It resists functionalist accounts of religion and is unapologetically theological. Oliver O'Donovan, a contemporary Christian theologian, argues that political theology, quote, connects political themes with the history of salvation as a whole. Against radical distrust of God talk, political theologians push back the horizon of commonplace politics and opens it up to the activity of God. So O'Donovan stands with some Muslim thinkers who, with constitutional safeguards, take God to be the only legitimate source of law and seek to discern legal intent through the examination of privileged revelation. Now, O'Donovan defends the liberal tradition. His problem is with secularist concepts of liberal democracy. Now, this kind of political theology, I mean really political theology, is exciting to some, dangerous to others. It appeals to divine authority, but it holds to the Enlightenment hope that competitive discourses might yield a politics which reflects true religion, though, in O'Donovan's case, by the witness of the gospel and the persuasion of the political leader rather than the use of another Charlemagne's sword. O'Donovan wants to mend a conversational breakdown within Christianity, but also between Christianity and secular theory. His controversial defense of Christendom as more than ideology, more than a power grab, which is the way most even Christians see it, travels in the direction of trying to overcome a division between politics and theology toward what he calls a confessedly Christian secular political order. This way of doing political theology could also include more dominant trends in Christian theology that are not so friendly to democracy, like Stanley Hauerwas's effort to imagine the church as an alternative politics, and many of the thoughts that John Milbank expressed last night. Fourth, each of these three models emphasize the history of ideas and theological or philosophical analysis. I think there's a fourth emerging model. It focuses on concrete practices, forms of attention, and dispositions that are the conditions of politics. This approach looks more like ethnography or cultural anthropology than the history of ideas, philosophy, and theology. Now, intellectual history, to my mind, need not compete for attention with social practices. The best of each learn from the other. But this new approach tells the story, for example, of religion and democracy less in terms of big ideas and more in terms of the micro-history of democratic movements. For example, in terms of the micro-history of democratic movements, which may have less to do with liberalism than most people assume. This is the burden, I think, of some of Charles Taylor's work, and more directly, my colleague Jeff Stout in Democracy and Tradition, and his forthcoming sequel volume, Blessed Are the Organized. For Stout, secularism is as bad as theocracy. Both hope for a shared theory of politics. Both are monological. Democracy is dialogical, with all beliefs in tow, including religious ones. Democracy relies on virtues necessary for a political society where we do not unjustly dominate each other, but we hold each other accountable to one another. So those are four models of what political theology looks like today. Now, Christianity and the rise of democracy. The standard narrative in the West focuses on the early modern exhaustion from religious violence. Can we live together without killing each other about religion? Can there be politics without privileged confessional orthodoxy expressed in institutional arrangements? Vittoria, Suarez, Grotius, Hobbes, Locke, Pufendorf, Kant, and some usual suspects in post-Reformation Christianity, mostly Christian, I would say including Hobbes, to varying degrees of orthodoxy, began to theorize collective self-government, principles of toleration, and eventually pluralism in the name of peace and order. These thinkers carved out an idea of human rights and constitutional order responsive to liberty, equality, and coercion. Hitched to these theories came consent-based theories of legitimacy rather than divine authorization, though many made appeal, like Locke, to God in heaven, calling us out of a state of nature. The social contract tradition, in effect, argued that certain liberties, given human passion and pride, are given up in exchange for the benefits of political society. On the Christian view, since the state cannot get you to heaven, religious liberty is a cornerstone of the tradition. After a long, halting history, Christians came to think that there are certain goods for which the state cannot and should not be responsible. Unlike Islam, early Christian piety was not wedded to statecraft, and Christian democracy warns against any effort to absorb the body of Christ into the state, especially since the state, more often than not, needs religion more than religion needs the state. Basically, the story can be summed up in the investiture controversy. Christians came to think the king should not appoint the bishop. Politics should not embody the whole truth, a point which even aristocratic liberals like Burke and de Tocqueville agree. We might want Athens without the slaves, but democracy is better than pitchforks and spooky metaphysics about collective and general wills. Democracy secures penultimate identity, responsive to goods that only the state can secure. Democracy is not morally bankrupt, but it's not the only game in town. There's no ideal normative political arrangement. Some are morally better than others, some encourage what is noble, some what is base. This, I think, is the path between skepticism and dogmatism about democracy. Some, like Kant, whose social contract was transcendental, not historical, held a more substantive conception. Kant thought there's a duty to support a political condition in which human rights are respected, not merely as a matter of self-interest or a remedy for inconvenience, but as part of the kingdom of ends. Other liberals argued that the origin of democracy lies not in Christian freedom, Hegelian progress, or Kantian respect, but fear of other human beings, especially the cruelty done in the name of religion. They say one person, one vote may be spiritually shallow, but it's the deepest we can get. Now, there are challenges to each of these narratives. I think the most critical come from Christian writers who see the rise of democracy as a consolidation of the nation-state and its economic and military power. Democracy is not a triumph of post-Christian humanism, but a decline into moral fragments, aided by missteps made within Christianity itself that drained politics of any relation to God. Other Christians are wary but willing Democrats. They challenge the self-congratulatory stories of the Enlightenment and the current Christian anti-liberal ones. They say Christianity was always preoccupied with the difference between spiritual and political authority, as Patrick has mentioned, even in deep Christendom. Here, democracy is an instrument of justice. Justice is prior to democracy as an ideal, but we will never have true justice in earthly politics. There are not enough good queens to count on, so majority rule and liberal principles are our best hope. Judah Sklar once wrote, "Liberalism is married to democracy, but it's a marriage of convenience." Now, I think liberal theory is not the only way to justify democracy. Nicholas Wolterstorff, for example, recently argues that the idea of human rights, the idiom of democracy, are not the supposed invention of early modern liberals. nor are they entitlements conferred by the democratic state. They can be found throughout Hebrew and Christian scripture and church fathers. Similar things could be said about the virtues of toleration and forbearance. A recent book is about to be published by John Bolin, which looks at the history of toleration and really challenges the standard narrative that it began in the 17th century. I think democracy depends on a secular realm where something like the ethical personality of individuals is respected. Protestants like myself like this story. Christian freedom defers to no one but God. The freedom of the individual is as deep as the freedom of God. But we often invoke a Catholic saint, Augustine of Hippo. Reinhold Niebuhr told one popular version, "Utopian striving is the seed of totalitarianism. Democracy is the least bad form of government because it recognizes the equality of sinners and government's limited sin-constraining role." Now, Augustine was neither liberal nor a Democrat. He supported persecutions, though only against fellow Christians, and he felt the need to argue about it given his beliefs about free will, which was a rare argument in the ancient world which accepted religious violence. But his writings start the long path that led to a Christian affirmation of the secular as secular, including democracy in a fallen world, giving the time of creation room to breathe, not wanting to make everything sacred. Augustinian eschatology and anthropology does not separate politics from virtue, but it lowers our pretensions. It tempers our lament about secular life. It is secularity without secularism, neither wholly religious nor wholly secular. I think a theme found in recent works by Jewish thinker David Novak and Catholic thinker John Finnis. There's no direct line from Augustine to Kant to James Madison, Reinhold Niebuhr, and John Rawls. Jonathan Edwards, America's Augustine, was a defender of monarchy. The British crown, he thought, was the best hope of Protestantism in a new world surrounded by evil Catholics. Now, we might add the Catholic Church's endorsement of democracy as the form of government that, as John Paul II put it, best coheres with the Church's vision of integral human development. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Church saw democracy as the celebration of the individual's independence from God and God's law. The French Revolution led to the Church's deep skepticism about democracy. Now, as the 20th century developed, the Church came to see its primary opponent no longer as democracy or enlightenment, but totalitarianism. George Weigel has emphasized the importance of the American experiment for the development of a Catholic critical embrace of democracy. Let me end. Today, there are no serious alternatives to democracy in Christian thought. Some Catholics come close in their discussions of abortion when they argue that democracy is not just an imperfect system, but a perversion of justice. Some Christians advocate monarchy still, or non-statist socialism, as we heard a version of last night. Stanley Hauerwas jokes he is a pacifist theocrat, he just hasn't figured out how to combine the two. But their advocacy, in theory, has no constituency in practice. Most prophetic challenges to democracy, if an alternative is proposed, bear the marks of the central features of the democratic tradition. Fights about liberalism, fights about democracy, are often proxies for other debates, like relativism, value pluralism, or views of morality as mere social agreement. The mainstream focus has shifted to the narrow debate about the role of religious reasons in public debate, or cultural criticism. But there are no real challenges to democratic institutions and a registry of rights and correlative civic obligations. However, I think we're conscious of standing at the end of a long march of democracy, at least democracy associated with the European Enlightenment and American Protestantism. Democracy has achieved amazing results, making possible the kinds of lives that all of us in this room are able to lead. But like many ages of transition, it requires moral imagination, a refashioning of traditions, and virtues necessary to face an uncertain future. Democracy can make excessive religious demands if you let it. I fear the emerging oligarchy of charismatic hucksters, corporate elites, policy wonks, and my fellow Christians who support them. But as Augustine said of Rome's virtues, they are not yet holy, they are less vile. Democracy is deficient, but it's not heresy all the way down. So I have a concessive, ambivalent, and provisional gratitude for democracy. Some questions remain. Questions of institutional design. What's the appropriate relationship between legislator and judicial domains? What about the relationship between capitalism and democracy, imperialism and democracy? What about the power of democracy to erode religious cultures, to erode the aspirations of excellence, to promote possessive individualism? What about the effect of technology and mass culture on democratic habits? And new questions on the horizon. What will be the effect of globalization and the maturity of international law in transforming assumptions and realities about democracy that are tied to a nation-state system? Alas, those are themes for later today.
Thank you, Eric. Jerome Kopolsky.
Well, first let me thank Michael Kessler and the Berkley Center for putting together this very exciting program. I think that I'm going to aim for the concrete, so to speak, in my presentation, the title of which is Between Exile and Redemption, Political Theology and the Shaping of Modern Jewish Thought. And I want to tell a story which traces the transformation of Jewish religious thought in the late 18th and 19th century, a transformation of thought that I think emerged to justify or legitimate the transformation of Jewish existence. And this transformation was motivated by a process in Europe known as the emancipation of Jews, the process and the debates over the granting of civil and political rights to the Jewish minority in the liberalizing states of Europe. Now, why was this process of emancipation a challenge to Judaism? Why would it sort of provoke an attempt to transform the way in which Jews thought about themselves and about the political meaning of the Jewish religion? Well, in order to answer that question, I need to provide, at least very quickly, a description of the pre-modern political theology of Judaism, a Jewish theology of exile. Now, from late antiquity up to the mid-18th century, the dominant political strategy of the Jewish people was an accommodation with prevailing powers. Jews did not have state power of their own, but were spread out in a diaspora and were subject to the whims of the communities, the political communities in which they resided. Now, during this time, Jews thought of themselves as members of a nation, as the people Israel, and the Jewish law, or halakha, had been the very heart of their religion, a reference point of Jewish norms and behavior. Yet even in these centuries of dispersion, Jews had managed to carve out of the exile a significant measure of legal autonomy and power over their own affairs. The memory of a sovereign Israelite kingdom and a temple ritual persisted in liturgy and lore and was idealized and fastened to a messianic hope for future redemption. The rabbinic understanding of the Torah, of life lived in accordance with the dictates of divine will, arranged the foundation of Jewish community and permitted the continuation and development of Judaism in the absence of territorial continuity or the powers of sovereignty. So the very structure of the Jewish community was the sacred space, so to speak, in which religion played itself out. The outside world of power, politics, and statecraft understood as a mere shadow play of the real drama of God's sovereignty and Israel's salvation. By providing theological and legal legitimation for the contemporary political situation, by possessing a halachic way of life, and imagining a future redemption which would include the restoration of a Jewish kingdom in the land of Israel, this political theology of Galut helped to shape and maintain the coherence and distinctiveness of Jewish communities throughout these centuries of exile, insecurity, and intermittent persecution. The Jewish people continued to live by their Torah, negotiated the shifting social, political, economic, and religious boundaries with non-Jews, and waited, mostly patiently, and occasionally not, for the eventual arrival of their Messiah. But with the dawn of modernity, the first rays of a new political dispensation began to emerge, which would cast the Jews again into a theological political crisis, one as radical and as transforming as that faced centuries earlier after the destruction of Jerusalem. So why did the possibility of attainment of civil and political rights pose a challenge, pose a problem to Jewish thinkers? The question came up, could Jews participate, could Jews be granted these rights as Jews, as practitioners of Judaism? Or would integration into the modern state require the loss of Judaism? Would it require conversion? Would it require some other religious commitment? Now, perhaps the first person to deal with these questions straight on was the Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn's treatise Jerusalem, or On Religious Power in Judaism, is often regarded as the first work of modern Jewish philosophy. Yet Mendelssohn did not attempt to articulate a particularly Jewish philosophy in this work, but rather to present a liberal political theory and a description of a Judaism which would, without difficulty, find its place in the modern enlightened state. Mendelssohn's Judaism was still a religion of law, but of a law regarded as a form of pedagogy, a law which inculcated correct religious ideas and cultivated good citizens, and ideas fully in accord with the doctrines of a rational, natural religion. By arguing that Judaism was based on revealed legislation, which had ceased to be political in character, and it ceased to be coercive in character, Mendelssohn believed that the Jews could enter modern society and still remain completely faithful to Judaism. Now, Mendelssohn's attempt to forge a synthesis, so to speak, between Judaism and philosophy subordinated Judaism's religious claims to those of the Enlightenment's idea of natural religion and to the political aspirations of the state. Quote, "We have no doctrines that are contrary to reason," Mendelssohn wrote to a friend. "We have added nothing to natural religion save commandments and statutes." But Judaism was endowed with an additional distinctive quality. By commanding actions and not beliefs, and by not sanctioning metaphysical beliefs distinct from the truths of natural religion, Judaism was rendered the most reasonable of religions, and the Jews, having been made aware of this conception of their faith, would develop into model citizens capable of being integrated into modern society and unencumbered by any of the intellectual difficulties which arise from allegiance to Christian dogma. Quote, "The fundamental tenets of our religion rest on the foundation of reason," Mendelssohn wrote. "They are in consonance with the results of free inquiry, without any conflict or contradiction," unquote. But the political theory upon which this detente depends did not emerge from Judaism itself. Though it retained a historical memory of the union of religion and politics in the Mosaic Constitution, Judaism, Mendelssohn claimed, did not promote any particular political teaching relevant to the modern state. Mendelssohn maintained, to be sure, that there existed a mutuality of aims between Judaism and the state. But this mutuality was shared by all positive religions. If there is a political distinctiveness to Judaism, it does not relate to the memory of the original Mosaic Constitution or to the history of the Israelite state, but rather to the fact that the Jewish law is capable of maintaining the truths of natural religion and fostering sociability. In such a way, Judaism reinforces the moral foundations of the state and aids in the state's pedagogic activities. Hence, Judaism helps secure the modern state. With Mendelssohn's Jerusalem, a new approach to Judaism's modern theological political problem emerged. Mendelssohn did not advocate a simple separation of spheres of religion and politics, but in a subtle way suggested that positive religion could and should work together with the political order to sustain and enhance social life. Mendelssohn believed he had found a solution to the theological political critiques of Judaism by means of his reinterpretation of the nature of Jewish law. His solution to the problem was really to deny it. As an observant Jew, Mendelssohn could not conceive of the possibility of Judaism devoid of its law. His solution, rather, was to reduce Judaism to its ceremonial law and the historical beliefs that are bound up with it. In such a way, Judaism could be found compatible both with his rational philosophy and his enlightened politics. By conveying the eternal truths of natural religion, reinforcing their apprehension, reinforcing sociability through the performance of a ceremonial ritual, Judaism would be transformed into the modern religion par excellence. Now, shortly after the publication of Mendelssohn's Jerusalem, a Berlin bookseller named Shaul Asher published a treatise provocatively entitled Leviathan. In it, Asher argued, in contrast to Mendelssohn, that the necessary modern reformation of Judaism would entail a turn from law to theology. By the mid-19th century, Asher's prophecy proved correct, as a new generation of liberal rabbis such as Abraham Geiger, Samuel Holtheim, and Ludwig Philippson began to articulate the idea of Judaism as a theological idea rather than as a legal idea. By understanding the Jewish idea as an insight into the nature of God and the ramifications of this insight for human ethical life, the idea of revelation as establishing a particular political arrangement had to be abandoned. All of the political conditions and structures of the Jewish past, Jewish nationality, theocracy, state, law, were thus relegated to the heap of contingent and outmoded external forms, which had served to protect the Jews as a people and their religious idea through the vicissitudes of history. The contemporary political meaning of Judaism was based not on any direct claim to the state or to their institution of law, but on the indirect influence of the Jewish ethical subject. The construction of such a modern liberal Judaism entailed the articulation of a new Jewish narrative, a history of Judaism for contemporary purposes, or a usable past, one orchestrated around this theological idea of Judaism, how this idea had arisen, how it had developed and was preserved, and the affirmation of its contemporary and enduring meaning. By stressing religious beliefs which form and stimulate ethical life, rather than stressing the comprehensive legal and ritual practice of pre-modern Judaism, Jewish reformers signaled their political accommodation with the emerging state and their belief that Judaism had a crucial role to play within it. They strove to present a Judaism that would not only be amenable to modern politics, but would also provide the foundation for participation in and the security of the political order. This meant not only dealing with issues of practical reform, of the synagogue liturgy and decorum, of ritual and domestic life, but the clarification, articulation, and promulgation of a Jewish theology, which would not only guide these adjustments and promote appropriate forms of religiosity and Jewish observance, but which would provide the very intellectual foundation of Jewish loyalty and devotion. This goal of asserting the idea of Judaism marked a much deeper urge to reform than the sundry earlier attempts at ritual or aesthetic changes. In former times, such a clarification of Judaism was, of course, unnecessary. Judaism was, in a sense, self-evident. It was a life lived according to the Torah. As the historian Mark Wiener argued in his seminal study of 19th century Jewish thought, having been removed from the center of Jewish life, the halakha needed to be replaced by another religious life form. Early in his career, the Jewish historian and rabbi Abraham Geiger, one of the central figures of the growing liberal movement in the 1830s, declared to a friend that, quote, even thinking Jews who seek to derive meaning for their lives by delving into the religious element of Judaism cannot point to any idea that would permeate it and give it life. Geiger continued, the Jew must always have something peculiarly Jewish about him, since only his love for Judaism will keep him from becoming part of the multitude. It is precisely because he deviates from the majority that he must find a more solid basis for his faith, which is his conviction. If he should fail to do so, or if he should prove unable to do so, then by this failure he demonstrates that his faith is only a morbid remnant of former times whose disintegration is only being delayed. Unquote. By successfully expressing its religious idea, Geiger believed that modern Judaism could be set on a firm theoretical foundation. It would need to be promoted as a religion, a confession. Only in this matter, Geiger believed, could the future of Judaism as a religion and of the Jews as a distinct religious community be assured. So it's in this creative act, I think, of developing Judaism's peculiar theological idea that we can locate the development of a new political theology. By defining the essence of Judaism as a religious idea, as distinct from the halakha or Jewish law, reformers such as Geiger developed a religious strategy that would support and complement the political goals of emancipation. Now, the liberal Jewish theologians like Geiger discovered the essence of Judaism in the concept of ethical monotheism, that is, the notion of God and man's moral responsibility proclaimed by the prophetic voice. From this understanding of what constituted Judaism and its essence, Judaism could overcome its limitations and a coherent and effective policy of reform could emerge. Practices and beliefs such as those relating to national particularity and political messianic hopes seem to be at odds with the project of integration. To resolve these issues, a good number of traditional views were reinterpreted or simply abolished. While traditional Judaism saw the Jews as a people and a community bound by Torah, the liberal ideology strove to put Judaism on this new foundation of a theological idea, and in doing so dissolve the particular national identity of the Jewish people. Now, this generation of Jewish thinkers did not develop a political theory as Mendelssohn did in Jerusalem. For the most part, they took the form and function of the modern state and its political values for granted, and believed that the Jews ought to be fully incorporated into civic life. They did not question whether Judaism itself endorsed an alternative model of political organization. If the essence of Judaism was not to be found in a particular political dispensation, Jewish commitment could coexist within a tolerant constitutional state, and indeed, Jewish ethical values would ground such a political order. And with the transfiguration of the Messianic idea to the mission of Israel, the Jewish reformers hoped to demonstrate the ongoing significance of Judaism, not only for the Jews, but for larger society as well. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Jerome. Paul Heck.
Let me add my thanks to Michael Kessler and the Berkley Center for organizing this rich conversation. I've been commissioned to talk about human rights, political equality, and democracy in Islam. And I'm going to try and just divide my comments into three sections, talking a little bit about these concepts in Islam, and then the theological dimension or component of these questions, and then concluding by offering some examples, two examples that can help maybe flesh out for us how these things work on the ground. Let me begin, though, by recalling John Milbank's pithy definition of political theology last night. He said, "We're not as secular as we think." So that births the question, how is transcendence represented, especially vis-a-vis these issues, human rights, political equality, democracy? How is transcendence represented? Therefore, theology becomes very important. Let me first say that Islam has an ancient tradition of human rights, expressed, for example, through the idea of justice in the marketplace, through the idea of care for the poor and needy. Also, for example, within the marriage contract, that both parties have basic rights to survival and dignity. So the basic idea here in this ancient tradition is that each individual, each party in society is playing its role in the service of a common goal. The common goal being a prosperous society that is pleasing to God, and that is marked by such characteristics as justice, mercy, modesty. And let me remind all of us that the religious order was never absorbed into the political order in the Islamic tradition. That's a modernist heresy in Islam, as it is in Christianity. If I can follow my colleague Patrick's suggestion. So, it's a very rich and complex tradition. Nevertheless, today we're facing a different understanding of human rights. It's more about individual choice, unencumbered by a tradition that defines, lays out the moral purpose of society. This modern outlook can be questioned, of course. The current financial crisis raises serious questions about whether a society can thrive a society that is based on the individual's unregulated pursuit of happiness, apart from other moral considerations. Still, we're confronted with the question, the idea that a person has political rights in a society irrespective of whether he or she supports what Islam says are the purpose and moral characteristics of the good society that make it pleasing to God. Does this idea exist in Islam? And how is it formulated exactly, that a person has political rights irrespective of whether he or she buys into what Islam says the purpose of life is? Yes, this appreciation of political equality exists in Islam. How it is concretely expressed today, though, is not unlimited. Every society has reservations about how far political equality, political rights extend. In our own U.S. tradition, socialism, communism, these are voices that have not enjoyed equality in the public sphere. So every society has these issues. Okay? However, in Islam today, the idea is there. The idea of political equality. How is it there? It is there as a natural response to political tyranny, as a natural response to arbitrary rule, in that Muslims are like everyone else. In encountering tyranny, arbitrary rule, oppression of rights, a stronger, sharper appreciation of rights comes into being, in and of themselves, valued in and of themselves. If those in power are oppressing people, even in the name of the state, then their rights should be secured somehow for the sake of a peaceful and orderly society. Their rights should be secured against such oppression. Therefore, a clearer concern for individual rights per se begins to take shape. And recent history, the last century, has plenty of examples of this happening in Muslim societies. The Iranian Constitutional Revolution of 1905, the response of the Turkish people to the 1998 military coup, authoritarian rule in several countries today. The result is that human rights discourse, democratic ambitions, political equality, these are pervasive and vibrantly discussed in Muslim societies today. These are fully integrated into the political discourse in Muslim societies. And at the same time, there's also a strong sense that God is part of human society, that the life of the political community is not devoid of a transcendent perspective. Yes, there can be some tension here, as mentioned before, between the appreciation for the individual's pursuit of happiness and the communal sense of the godly purpose of society. Yes, there can be tension. In Morocco, where I currently live, there is ongoing discussion about the nature of the Pledge of Allegiance to the king, who was a descendant of the prophet. Is this pledge to the king, who was a descendant of the prophet, this Pledge of Allegiance, which is also mentioned and located in a constitutional framework, is it a religious contract or is it a social contract? There's a lot of discussion about this. There's tension. So there can be tension, but this need not be the case. It depends on how transcendence is understood and what limits it is understood to have. Transcendence limited. This is a very important concept, a very old concept in Islam. The key to this, of course, is the theological formula. How is transcendence theologically packaged? For example, does it include a reverence for secularity? Is the world and creation and all of us, both Mark Lilla and John Milbank, are they all part of transcendence? Right? Is secularity, the idea that existence, is secularity, existence that is not explicitly religious in character, is it also seen as part of transcendence? A second important element is the idea, the religious sense that religious knowledge is limited, that not all aspects of society are governable by what God has revealed, and the religious heritage born from that revelation, right? Can revelation tell us what to do about urban planning? Can it tell us what to do about adjudicating water rights? You know, religious knowledge, a religious sense that religious knowledge is limited. Is religious knowledge alone capable of engendering a modern polity in toto? If not, then, as Muslims acknowledge, there is a lot of room to maneuver when it comes to the shape of the political space. Rights, equality, democracy. The political space can be discussed. In my paper, I offered a couple examples, and I'd just like to mention them very briefly, if I have a few minutes here. Okay. First of all, the Gulen movement in Turkey. This is a multi-million member movement. How is it that they are highly pious and also able to accommodate, engage, build bridges with, even love others who do not share their piety? Well, there's a deep theme in this movement where there is this strong reverence for secularity as part of transcendence. It comes out of a tradition in Islam of the idea that the names of God are expansive, that all of us actually represent something of the names of God. This group has played a fundamental role in bringing a religious formula to the sharpened appreciation for human rights and democracy following the 1998 coup in Turkey. Okay? They bring together secular people with religious people, and there's very rich discussion, and they've been key, I think, in helping the current political party in Turkey understand how these things can go together, right? And I think it's all kind of going back to this deeper notion of the reverence for secularity in their religious outlook. And in fact, I would say that Turks in general understand now that religion is a better guarantor of freedom than the secular establishment. I think that's pretty clear to Turks these days. My second example is Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's much more complex. And I'm not speaking here of its opposition to Israel. That's a whole nother can of worms. But rather, I'm talking about its interaction with Lebanon's domestic politics. Hezbollah's interaction with Lebanon's domestic politics. We see mixed evidence here of an appreciation for democracy. Sometimes Hezbollah calls for greater political equality and an end to a political system based on confessional politics rather than representative democracy. Hezbollah is the loudest voice for representative democracy in Lebanon's domestic politics. Representative democracy as opposed to confessional, tribal-based politics. However, at the same time, Hezbollah also seems to have these aspirations to a political community where religious knowledge, as adjudicated by a select clerical group, is applicable to all aspects of society, to economics, to politics, everything. Only really the clerical elite can make the final decision. So in all these areas, democratic choices are somehow superfluous. Why this ambiguity in the Hezbollah outlook? What's its theological formula that lends itself to this ambiguity? Well, just very briefly, Hezbollah is heir to two traditions. Hezbollah is heir to two Shiite traditions, to a Shiite tradition, a long-standing traditional one that has long recognized that religious knowledge is limited, especially in the political sphere, especially in the absence of the final imam. Okay, it recognizes that religious knowledge is limited in the political sphere. And so the political sphere need not be explicitly religious to be legitimate. And so you can have representative democracy in that sphere. However, Hezbollah is also heir to a more recent modernist Shi'i argumentation that claims that religious knowledge is not limited. It has to do with this thing called mantaqat al-faragh, this empty sphere that who is to define it? It's not defined in the Sharia texts, right? Capitalism, communism, all these things. Who's to define it? There's, in recent modernist Shiite thinking, there's this argument that says that religious knowledge is not limited, and so therefore specialists in religious knowledge, the clerics, have a privileged right to rule because they have to bring religious knowledge to those areas, to economics, to politics. Therefore, religious knowledge can, in fact, engender a modern polity. So Hezbollah is between these two things, right? One tradition in Shiism that recognizes that religious knowledge is very limited in the political sphere, and another that is trying to fill it. And I think that's very much coming out of the modernist discourse in Shiite thinking. So, to conclude, the point is that we're not as secular as we think. But we need to pay close attention to how that formula is theologically, to how transcendence, we need to pay close attention. It's very key to pay close attention to how transcendence is theologically formulated. So let's map it out. Let's map out how theologies are formulated, and I think that'll give us a much better sense of where politics are going in the Muslim world today. Thank you.
Emergence of a number of conversations amidst and across a number of disciplines about the resurgence of religion, or that there was no resurgence, but that now there's a scholarly resurgence. Everyone seems to be interested in the intersection of religion and politics, and there are conferences that abound, and the concern that I have is that we need to pay more careful attention to the methodological tasks at hand. And the paper that I have been developing for this, for the volume that will come out of this conference, so you'll have to read the paper there to get the full version, looks to similar developments in comparative religious ethics over the last 40 years to gain insight into the methodological tasks, pitfalls, and obstacles that comparativists faced in religious ethics as a way to then build on and move forward in comparative political theologies. Because one of the things that I think you'll notice is that there are similar trends amidst diverse traditions, texts, and languages, and beliefs and practices. And coupled with that is the fact that when we're dealing with the relationship between theologies and political systems and political institutions, we are also faced with the massive responsibility to deal with material, social, and economic causes as it factors that shape reflexive theology, and also that where theologians and practitioners shape the political in turn. So what I'd like to do in a couple of minutes is sort of just highlight a few things that comparative religious ethics might inform us about as we proceed in this task of studying political theologies. The first task, or the first methodological insight, is that as we've seen already, we have a definitional task that is facing us. Last night even, the panelists implored us to not use political theology or political theologies, but theologies of the political. I'll leave it to you in the moment to parse out what those distinctions might mean. But there's a host of terms which are used differently, as we've seen. Religion, tradition, authority, politics, the political, power, equality, I could go on, freedom. All of these mean different things within different traditions. The comparative problem there is that even at the level of a generic concept, the concept does not adequately or easily cross over between traditions. The study of political theologies invokes a host of other pluralisms. There's the obvious fact of multiple religions. There is the incredible pluralism within traditions. Paul just gave one example of this. Same resources, different geopolitical context, very different construction of political relationship, And at the same time, Paul's work shows that this is not simply or merely due to different material circumstances, but in fact is because of the complex relationship between the people, the tradition, and the geopolitical circumstances that they're in, as well as they have different ways of interpreting the tradition. All of these things show this diversity within the tradition. And at the same time, as a religious ethicist, I'm interested in both the communal and the individual level. And as we all know, adherents to religions do not fall into a monolithic reality of being a Christian or a Muslim, but in fact there is, even within movements, within religious traditions, an incredible diversity. So the first point is pluralisms abound, and a methodology that would investigate the relationship between the political and the religious needs to recognize that all the way down. This means that quick and easy generic comparisons, when you hear a word that seems the same or a movement that seems the same, can't be quickly made. And as David Little and Sumner Twiss in a classic, one of the first accounts of comparative religious ethics put it, the attempt to typify whole religious traditions and then to compare them with each other in broad terms is liable to gross oversimplification. It may be grossly oversimplifying to state that, but I think it needs to be the first point that we recognize. Likewise, that if that is the case, one of the potential options is a notion of incommensurability between traditions, and then a comparative project seems to stop dead in its tracks. Within comparative religious ethics, there have been three sort of major types of conducting comparison. The first was typified by a classic account by Ron Green using a Kantian construction of rationality, which looked at, across traditions, attempting to put particular manifestations within a broad general framework of rationality. How are they rational in this way? How are these guys rational in this way? I think a more nuanced version of this was offered by Chris Gamwell in a volume that was actually edited by Robin Lovin and Frank Reynolds. Robin is here. In which he thought that there was a fundamental comprehensive question that all individual humans ask, which is asked in different ways across traditions, but you can isolate that questioning and then place individual types of religions within that broader framework. A second method, which has been developed more recently, is trying to construct concepts of human nature or of virtue, and looking at, while maintaining the difference and particularities of different religious traditions, making comparisons across those religious traditions by looking at the way this Buddhist text constructs human nature and this Christian text constructs human nature. It is a self-conscious recognition that no master narrative works. It is a self-conscious recognition that a concept might be able to offer us some methodological insight, but at the same time, the particularities are going to be limited. The third method that I think is out there, and if you think of this as a kind of broad spectrum, this is sort of at the other end, is what has sometimes been referred to as pragmatic holism. Holism resists common concepts or universals, and instead it focuses on the embeddedness of ethical categories within the linguistic, social, cultural, textual, and material circumstances of a particular religious tradition. It critiques the formalists for imposing their own categories of rationality, and it seeks instead to discover how cultures understand moral demands in relation to their account of basic inescapable order in the nature of things. This model is often used, and I think this conference to some extent follows this model. We bring experts together working within the traditions. We try to gain clarity about how the interworkings of those traditions deal with the relation between religion and the political. The comparative element is something that we then need to move on in a different vein. One note of caution which comparative religious ethicists offered, there are multiple notes, but which I think are germane for our conversation moving forward. For instance, David Little and Sumner Twiss in their book Comparative Religious Ethics offered this caution. In the emerging and as yet ill-defined area of the comparative study of religious ethics, there is much more to be investigated. We are aware that for comprehensive understanding, it is not enough to analyze a few selected texts from various traditions or to examine only the more or less official accounts of non-literate practical beliefs. A few things are going on there. One is we have to be very careful about how we pick and choose the people we're studying. Last night, some of the conversation got into, well, why is Hobbes representative of the tradition? Why not Montesquieu? Why not Tocqueville? Why not, Joe the plumber, as you might have discovered when you got home after that conversation. One question you have to face is, why are we framing the conversation the investigation in a certain way to focus on these people and these texts and not others? Second, and I think more powerfully, Jeff Stout, not long after, in the early 80s, more powerfully, was concerned that comparative ethics is less a discipline than a sort of floating seminar in which scholars from various fields trade information and discuss methodology, because most people around the seminar table only know one or two traditions at best and are rightly anxious to resist hasty generalization. Most of the information being exchanged is introductory and fragmentary. And he goes on, and I think it's important to think about this as we think about how to study political theologies in some mode comparatively. Stout says, it seems doubtful that the hope from a generation of Renaissance comparativists will ever be realized. Life is short and human minds are finite, so there is some danger that the next generation's comparativists will know less than we do about anything in particular, and that they will have even more trouble than we have had explaining why anyone outside the guild ought to take their pronouncements seriously. Comparativists may someday have a more secure niche within the academic bureaucracy than we have had, but what of moral and historical substance will they have to offer their students? When the professors alternate between collating some facts and manipulating jargon, who outside the profession has reason to listen? I think one of the concerns that was being expressed in the formative period of comparative religious ethics is that the picking and choosing or the attempt to gain some insight by, I'll take these texts and I'll compare it with these texts, is of limited use in understanding the more broad framework of a religious tradition. The third sort of set of questions is, what are the goals of comparative political theologies? And here, again, insight from comparative religious ethics can be gained. Most comparative religious ethicists that I examined for this thought that there were a couple of points, and I think these are actually useful for thinking about what our goals are in making comparisons. The first is that even though the comparativist, this is from Little and Twiss again, first, even though the comparativist may not have mastered the languages and scholarships of individual traditions, he or she can provide a perspective and a way of analyzing a tradition that otherwise does not occur to the specialist. So by having somebody from the outside look at this, it might offer insight which then you have now had an enriched experience and understanding and can move forward in the scholarship, but you have to be the one to move forward. The guy that is not trained in the languages and traditions can't be the person to do that. Second, the comparativist can advance the work of religious ethicists by broadening their horizons. And third, the comparativist can contribute to a much neglected aspect of the study of the history of religions, namely the systematic examination of religion and morality in various cultures. So it pushes different aspects. So for comparative political theologies, it's the specific relationship between the political and the religious, which we might be able to push forward in a broader in the broader context of studying politics, or in the broader context of studying religion. Schoeffer, Stalnaker, and Lewis, the bridge concept, the middle methodology that I mentioned before, had asserted that a comparative inquiry has the potential to improve our understanding of particular texts or thinkers by making us attentive to issues or concerns that prior to comparison we overlooked. So it's not just looking at the text in a particular way, it's that we bring in issues from other areas, other ways of looking at phenomena, and then thereby our comparison is enriched. I think that there's then a danger that the different methods could fall into, which is trying to make these too easy comparisons. At the same time, the kind of response which would say that we can't have any acknowledgement across traditions seems equally unpalatable as an option. Obviously, there are similar geopolitical forces that different religious groups are responding to, so there is this material interaction, and we need to be able to understand how those different forces operate across different religious traditions. So I'll just close with a bit of reflection about the papers that we read as examples, and I want to kind of tease out what I see as 4 distinct methodologies, all of which I would be interested in hearing more about. And no, I'm not making any judgment that any of these is right. I think, in fact, a multiplicity of methodologies will be important. What I'm interested in doing is mapping them out and thinking more about their limits and their uses. The first is what I would call Patrick Deneen's historical theoretical normativism. I think that he is engaged in a task of narrative, which in a lot of ways is descriptive, but I think that his argument is that, or what I see in the paper that I read of his, is that description has an implicit normativity because you have to get the description right, and there is a right account of the historical, theoretical trajectory that can be made, and that is important because it challenges the wrong kind, or the less adequate descriptions of the development of a particular political theology. I would say that Jerome Kopolsky is a kind of descriptive genealogist. Jerome's method is to offer a historical analysis of how Judaism grapples with modernity, but providing a genealogical account. Where did they start and where did they end up, and what were the forces that made that transition happen? What were they responding to? What intellectual and theological resources were they bringing to the table? The third sort of method that I saw here was Eric Gregory, which I'm calling a pragmatic political theologian. Eric strikes a normative tone from the start. I'm going to lay my cards on the table, and he is a scholar doing political theology. He is interested, as I read it, as engaging in a conversation with the tradition he is working within, and looking at how it is that tradition is responding to different intellectual arguments, as well as self-reflexively constructing its own modern identity in the face of those intellectual and intellectual forces of liberalism. And finally, Paul Heck is what I would call an internal comparativist. He is doing comparative work within a particular tradition, engaging in why different, and I mentioned this before, engaging in a study of why two different kinds of groups who have the same kinds of tradition and resources standing behind them, who are in different geopolitical circumstances, have different attitudes towards the ruling authority, have different attitudes towards political legitimation, and have different attitudes towards what are the goals and ends of both political life and religious life. And I think of note here is that he's neither a materialist nor an idealist. One or the other is not driving the cart in its entirety, but rather there is a complex interaction of all of these things. All of that smorgasbord is simply to suggest that we have even before us 4 different kinds of ways of engaging in political theology, in the study of political theologies. And we have, on my understanding, a pressing need to develop more clarity about the methodologies that we will use. My larger paper will make those connections in a hopefully much more coherent way than 10 minutes of hopping around a more formal paper can do, but I wanted to give you these insights. So my question, we have about 12 minutes left of this panel. I was hoping for a bit more time. Jerome started on the bad track whenever somebody begins a paper by saying, I'm going to tell you a story, hold on, you know it's going to take a while. But my question for the rest of the panel, maybe to get us started, is in this methodological vein. What do you think ought to be the goals of studying political theologies? And I would ask this in 4 different ways. As a critic, as a political theologian standing within your tradition, as a scholar, and that can be both a scholar and a practitioner believer, as a scholar standing outside of a tradition, and then finally as a scholar who is looking at a tradition in conversation with other traditions and the trends within multiple traditions. So I open that question to you, and then we'll go from there. Patrick?
I come from the world, the very strange and foreign world of political science, in which questions of methodology, especially in the subfield known as American politics, have tended to crowd out the study of the phenomena of politics. That is to say, I've attended innumerable seminars and conferences in which the conversation inevitably devolves into a discussion of the methodology that was used to arrive at the conclusions, and the conclusions of the paper are inevitably ignored or downplayed. And so I would say that we ought not to trip ourselves up at the outset of this project by excessively worrying about our methodological assumptions. Where there are points of intersection for discussion, I think we ought to have those. And where there are not, then we ought not to pursue them at the cost of losing those intersections. So I agree that I think we need to, one of the things we need to do quite clearly at the outset is at least begin to put on the table what we mean by political theology. And what I started with was simply accepting some of Mark Leela's understandings or definitions of that. That may or may not be other people's. And so I think that's, as a starting point in this particular project, that's a desirable thing. But beyond that, I'd say let the conversation unfold as it will, and let's let the subject matter drive it, and not concerns of whether or not we're going to have methodological agreement.
Jerome?
Yeah, well, I'd follow on that. Political theology, as we discussed last time, is not really a native term. And it's certainly not a native term in Jewish thought. I would say neither is the word theology native. It becomes, I think, important in the Jewish story because of the critique of Judaism that emerges in the Enlightenment, where Judaism is seen as a political theology or as a political religion. And this is something that is very strongly offered in Spinoza's theological political treatise. And it's a theme that's picked up by thinkers such as Kant. So this notion of this particular tradition having a political theology or being a political religion, and that being the problem for Jews who wish to enter into the modern state, becomes, at least in the way I read this history, the the problem, that how can Judaism be described as not having those characteristics that thinkers like Spinoza or Kant ascribe it, and at the same time understand or try to offer what Jews, as Jews, can provide to the modern state in forms of ethical legitimacy. So I think that to be careful when we're talking about the term political theology, to embed it within in the native terms and assumptions of that tradition, if there are, and to see if in fact there is a pushback, or if there's an influence of that term in the way that they then see themselves and describe themselves.
I guess I see myself doing political theology both as an outsider and an insider. I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Catholic, a Roman Catholic, not an Anglo-Catholic, just to get that straight. I have a certain reverence for secularity. But I guess what I want to do is just understand Islam. And I can't do that without understanding the subjectivity of Muslims, right? What I guess I've noticed in the study of Islam, whether in political science or elsewhere, is limitations in getting at the inner point of view of Muslim groups, movements, parties, so on and so forth. We need to understand the arguments they're making, and also the fact that the arguments are never static. There's often a tendency, I notice, to try and reduce Muslims to definitions. And so for me, political theology, which is not a native term, as it were, a native term for the Islamic tradition, and yet you see the reality there. It's there without the name. And so how do we get at it? Well, we have to enter into conversation, and we have to see the arguments going on behind the political attitudes. Very interesting arguments that are constructed theologically in very diverse ways. And they're never static, because, I mean, what I mean by when I say I'm also an insider, I have to enter into a dialogue to understand the subjectivity, not just the objectivity of my focus of research. And suddenly you realize that people's views are changing, and yet there are these parameters, or themes, some of them that I laid out before. And so for me, it's just necessary in order to understand the fuller picture of politics in Islam. And I think political science, in the modernist sense, is struggling to try and get at that perspective. So,
Eric?
Yeah, just very quickly, I consider myself a humanist in the sense of the humanities, and the goal of political theology is the similar goal of the humanities, of examining and trying to understand what is true, good, and beautiful. That sounds very old-fashioned, but that's what I see. More particularly, I think there's a kind of historical amnesia about these traditions, and so I also consider myself an intellectual historian. I worry with Patrick that the debates about method can become very boring and lose the audience and lose the substance. In religious studies, my home discipline, it's almost interminable debates about what is religion. I do wish scholars in related fields might problematize their own methodological discussions of religion, and that might be a helpful contribution to the political scientists who talk about religion. I have my optimism is I keep getting emails from colleagues in political science who want to, what does Aquinas think about this? Who was Karl Barth? And I think one of the things, at least coming from a secular university, and I would say across, I know one or two people who teach theology in universities in America that are not affiliated with churches. Georgetown's unique, Notre Dame's unique, UVA is relatively unique. But, I mean, the absence of theology in the American university is striking. I mean, there is no theologian in American secular research universities that's not attached to a divinity school or a Catholic school. And given the world we live in today, I think that one of the goals has to be, not just understanding, but the depth of understanding that also allows for the confidence of arguments. And Christians need to understand their own tradition more, I think, before they can judge others. But hopefully there will become a point where the discussions that happen out there in the world in a rather uncivil, truncated way, we should model something better than that, but not just discussions of Foucault, but discussions of, I teach courses on religion and politics, hard questions, Why do clergy have tax-exempt status in the United States? I think that's a political theology question.
Yeah. All right, thanks. Even though the bell rang, I have 2 minutes left, and so if anybody has a pressing question for anybody on the panel, if you can make it extremely brief, and we will be brief in response. Yes.
I know this is really a very brief question, but it gets to this issue of theology, using the term theology. I wonder why theology as opposed to religious discourse on politics. I think that may be a more useful approach because theology suggests pushing us towards a more formal, textual, and institutional direction of understanding what religion has to say about politics. Whereas much of the debate about politics from a religious perspective happens in the civil sphere. We're in a country where 90 or 95% of people consider themselves believing Christians. I was wondering what you thought about that. You used the term theology.
Well, I would respond to that along 2 lines. One is that that's a particular construction of theology to push it to text, institution, and tradition. And I would push back with what Paul said, which is he's doing political theology in order to understand the subjective response and construction of political identity. I don't know if you have more thoughts about that.
I would just say the danger of just calling it religious discourse is that you fail to understand the distinctions, and you have to do some type of theological analysis to get at the very important and yet not always obvious distinctions in religious discourse. One person is saying the same thing as another, and they're in their same tradition. They're using the same language, but you get at it, and then suddenly you see these distinctions, and you really, I think we need theology as a method, even if someone doesn't belong to that tradition.
Yeah.
So.
Eric, did you look like you? Okay.
No.
Another question?
I'll let it keep
Ken?
going.
I share many of the reservations discussing methodology. There's a famous remark that Manuel Levinas makes in response to a question, what about your methodology? And he says, all the books that people put together, they never touched upon the question of methodology. But that being said, it seems to me that one could perhaps keep in mind at least 2 different methodologies. And I'm reminded of something that the Egyptologist John Osman writes in one of his books. A book, I don't think it's available yet in English. It's called Hashab Hayr. It's basically a study of power and salvation in Egypt. But he has some sort of a methodological introduction to that book, and being also the person responsible for the legacy of Jacob Taubes, he thinks about what political theology might mean. And he says, well, basically, we would have to distinguish between what he calls beschreibende and betreibende political theology.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically descriptive and constructive.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he then, I think, takes up the descriptive notion and carries it into different contexts that are not necessarily Christian or medieval or modern, for that matter. But I think that distinction, could you have like an outsider's perspective on the theological political phenomenon, or would you ipso facto elaborate some of the preconceptions coming out of the tradition from within operate? That I think is an important question. And just a footnote to that, Osman's work, I think, brings up important issues because the suggestion that he gives us is that one could speak of political theology in this descriptive sense, while at the same time extending it into contexts which would seemingly have nothing to do with theology and distinct conception of the political or perhaps even of religion as we know it. Right? So one could wonder whether indeed a useful discussion of political theology will always take place within the parameters that John Wilbank laid out yesterday. more along possible avenues of research by combining anthropology and classics.
Okay, with that, let us close the first panel. We will reconvene at 1:15 back in this room, and I hope you'll all be able to return.